what is the nucleus of this book is more of a personal wondering on whether evil exists inside every one of us. And if it exists inside every one of us, does it lead us to evil actions? Under which circumstances it can lead us to actions in which we can express this evil, and this kind of thoughts. And in a way, it led me to another question. What if one of your favorite uncles, let's say the cool uncle of yours, used to be an evil man in his past, a man of violence? What does this say about the person he is right now? What does it say about his interaction with other people, and how does it affect his relationships with his loved ones?
Dimosthenis, I recently read your collection of short stories titled Jak. We have the same word in Albanian, and we'll try to explain that later, the title. But before we get into that, I wanted to say that reading your short stories felt like I was listening to these voices that have been carrying something heavy and painful, but also very human for a really long time. So before we get into all the details, I'm curious to ask, when you were writing these stories, was there a specific space that you were trying to create for these voices? And what did you want them to be able to say that maybe isn't usually heard?
When I was writing these stories, what I was aiming for was to be as faithful to the way these people viewed the world, and try to put on paper as faithfully as possible the way they experienced trauma and the difficulty of reintegration in their societies of origin. So I made early on a very specific choice about how I'm gonna write these stories, which had to do with the choice of the POV of the narrator, and the language they would use. This language is the dialect arvanitas of southern Greece, used when speaking Greek. And I also incorporated into their way of speaking phrases and words from their mother tongue, which is Arvanitica, a medieval Albanian dialect the Arvanitas of Greece still speak.
I'm curious, was there a particular reason you chose an Arvanita word for the title rather than the Greek equivalent?
Actually, the characters of my short stories are all Arvanites coming from central Greece, from the region where I come from. And the choice of the title had to do with mainly with this choice of mine. When I had finished writing the book and I was looking for a title, I'm really bad in finding titles for my book. So at some point, I sent the last short story of the collection to a friend of mine who's kind of one of my first readers. And I asked him for his opinion on the story and if he had any idea of what the title of the collection could be. And when he replied, he said, he gave me his feedback on the story, and he said, when it comes to titles, I would suggest, if you want a whole sentence, I will cut your braids and throw it in the bushes, which is the title of the first short story, or Gjak. At first, Gjak sounded to me a bit weird because I hadn't heard it quite enough, and I had never thought of, how could this describe the whole collection. But the more I was thinking about it, the more I was realizing that Gjak is the main axis that connects the short stories of the collection. It's more or less, the line of blood that connects the characters, the narrators of the stories. And in a way, it represents this set of rules and customs that dictates and how they should live their lives. And I also like the fact that it's a word that is not widely known in Greece. So it was giving the impression that this book is about something not familiar, which was one of my aims in writing this book. That the world that I'm describing through the stories is not a world that we know in mainstream Greek history, despite the fact that it's a world that I know really well because I have Arvanitic origins. I grew up in an Arvanitic village in central Greece, so the whole atmosphere and this type of characters were really well known to me. Unfortunately, I don't speak Arvanitic, the Arvanitic language. I know a couple of expressions and a couple of words because in the recent decades, the language has the population of people speaking the language has declined, and this language being an oral language is really hard to learn if you don't pick it up when you're young.
Was there any resistance from your publishers or editors when you proposed the title, since it's not a well-known word in Greece or in Greek?
Curiously enough, not at all.
Really?
They kind of accepted the title quicker than I did. So I was lucky in this sense.
When people hear that word, the word Gjak, but also in English, blood, often what comes to our minds is some form of violence. And I'm curious, what was the personal spark that made you want to write these stories? Was it family memory, oral stories, your Arvanite background?
It really comes from question that under other circumstances, it would not have led to a literary book. So what is the nucleus of this book is more of, a personal wondering on whether evil exists inside every one of us. And if it exists inside every one of us, does it lead us to evil actions? Under which circumstances it can lead us to actions in which we can express this evil, and this kind of thoughts. And in a way, it led me to another question. What if one of your favorite uncles, let's say the cool uncle of yours, used to be an evil man in his past, a man of violence? What does this say about the person he is right now? What does it say about his interaction with other people, and how does it affect his relationships with his loved ones? But this, as you can understand, cannot lead to a short story or whatever. It's more of a general kind of question. So at some point, while I was still, let's say in this tunnel thinking about this, I made a trip to Asia Minor, modern Turkey, for the needs of my PhD. I needed to visit some archaeological sites there. And during the long hours of waiting in the bus to get from one place to the other, I was pondering on this sense of familiarity I had with the place, despite the fact that it was the first time I was visiting Asia Minor. And it was then that I realized that I had first heard of the region through stories that I was listening as a child in my village by people at the age of my grandpa, who were narrating stories about their own fathers who had fought in the Greco-Turkish War, which happened immediately after the end of the First World War. In Greece, we call it the Asia Minor campaign. So I find it really interesting that I was visiting this place almost 100 years after my ancestors had been there as a tourist. And I was thinking about this kind of, let's say, queer thing, me being there as a civilian, as a
Yes,
tourist,
yes.
more or less the same age. They were there as soldiers fighting in a really brutal war. And when I returned back to England, because back then I was still studying in Oxford, these two seeds, let's say, these two thoughts kind of came together. The evil that everyone carries in himself, and these stories of soldiers fighting 100 years before in Asia Minor. And I realized that in order for me to better investigate this initial question of mine about evil, I had to kind of contextualize it in a narration that was taking place during that period of time, because I wanted also to have characters that were more or less archaic. So the arvanitas of the beginning of the 20th century, at least in my region, were not that much different in the way they viewed the world, in the way they were organized in their values than the arvanitas of, I don't know, the 14th century, for example. So
Yes.
in a way, I had the chance to work with these characters that have not yet been, let's say, softened by modern civilization and humanism, while the action of the stories would be taking place in an era where everything would be more or less familiar to the reader. I would not have to describe from the beginning, what a car is, how a shoe looked like, or whatever. And I also thought that, the Asia Minor campaign is a good context for this, good historical context for these stories, because in a way it's something like the Greek Vietnam. So there is lots of violence from both sides, and a big trauma for the people that participated in this conflict. And after I decided that that this would be the world in which these stories of mine would take place, I started thinking about the way these stories would be written, like first person narrative, third person narrative, or whatever. And again, I decided to go with first person narrative because I wanted to emulate as faithfully as possible, the way these people spoke, and therefore the way these people viewed the world and interpreted the world around them. This led in a way to the first short story I ever wrote for Gjak, which is I don't know how it's translated in Albanian. In Greek is San Viene Hodja Sojami, which means when the imam comes out for the morning prayer. This story was more or less, the first test of mine to see how I can work with this material I had decided to use for this book. And after I finished it, I felt a bit of confidence that I can follow through with my plan, but still I knew that there was something missing. I knew that I might have to deal with a bigger challenge because of the language that I had chosen to use. And I did a second test. I wrote a second short story, which due to its subject was more demanding. It's the story called Bukubardia. Bukubardia in Arvanitic is a word we use for a particular variety of figs. It's bukabard, the ones that have white flesh. And in Bukubardia, I have created a character that speaks about his first ever visit of an archaeological site, in specific the site of the ancient Greek city of Miletus in Asia Minor, and he kind of narrates his impressions about this visit. And I thought that this would be the most difficult thing that I would ever be called to do in this book. I mean, use a really low register spoken language to describe something really complex, like an archaeological site. I wanted, in a way, to measure the possibilities and what I could do with this language and what I couldn't do. Because usually when you have to describe an archaeological site or speak about more complex and more abstract ideas, the proper Greek is much better suited to do it, and the more archaic Greek, let's say. So after I finished this second source story, I also, felt a bit more confident to get into the book proper. So this is more or less how I approach the whole thing.
The way you write, it feels, at least in this collection, it feels quite different from more conventional storytelling. Many of the stories have this sort of confessional quality where someone is either telling their own story or they are passing on something they've heard. And at the same time, there aren't many visual descriptions. So I'm curious, when you sat down to write these stories, were you hearing the narrator speaking first, or did you see the scenes visually? Did you have an image in mind?
It was a bit of both. Certain stories started from a scene I had visualized, and I wanted to depict. So, I kind of build the story around this scene. But in all of the short stories, I kind of heard the narrator in my head. This sounds a bit too poetic, but please let me explain. It's much more prosaic than that. In order for me to be as close to and as faithful to the writing style I have chosen for these short stories, I had to emulate the way these people would have spoken. So for before writing down anything, I was creating this character in my mind. I was imagining the way he speaks, the way he goes around for his everyday jobs, the way he interacts with his loved ones, the way he behaves in certain situations, the way he expresses his anger or whatever kind of feelings. So in a way, I could hear him in my head. I was like, listening to an audio recording, which was, of course, of my creation. This is why I'm saying that, it's a bit more prosaic. And when I was sure that I had a grasp on how this character speaks, then I was sitting down and writing the story in one go so that I would not lose, this sense of flow that people have when they're narrating orally a story. Because this was another thing that I was trying to achieve in these short stories. I want to give the impression that what you're reading is kind of a writing down of something that has been recorded with a tape recorder, for example. So I wanted to have this pseudo feeling of orality. And since I was using a local dialect, I was trying to differentiate their voices by having one of them speaking, more dialectically, another one speaking a bit less, using more common modern Greek, let's say, than the other. And in the occasions where they were under great emotional stress, I was having them speaking in their mother tongue, which is arvanitica, in a language that the average Greek reader does not understand. And this is why I was, having a translation of these parts at the bottom of the page as well.
The original in Greek has the stories written with parts in arvanitica and then with translations at the bottom of the page. Because when I read the translation in Albanian or in English, that's what it is. It doesn't have any notes at the bottom of the page.
In the Greek one, there was a translation, and this is where actually the title, the word of the title, Gjak, first appears as well. In the first story, where the main character speaks about his sister, and he says that it's one sister, one mother, a whole blood. He says that in arvanitica. So it's the first occasion that the word Gjak appears in the body of the text.
So your narrators are wounded men returning from war, and I'd like to ask you, do you see a parallel with how Balkan societies, Albania, Greece, but also other societies in the Balkans, treat their damaged men, if we can say that?
Well, unfortunately, yes. I mean, in one of the problems in Balkans, at least in Greece, is that we tend to avoid to speak about the more difficult parts of our recent history. So when it comes to the Greco-Turkish War at the beginning of the 20th century, we always focus on the stories of glory. How the initial stages of the war, the Greeks, defeated the Turks and liberated parts of Greece that up to that point were under Turkish rule. Or we focus on the stories of the Greek refugees that came to Greece at the end of this war through an agreement of population exchange. But nobody speaks about, at least until recently, nobody was speaking about the impact this war had on the people that fought in this war. There were still stories going around about what people did there and how they were affected. But let's say the official Greek history has never dealt, in detail with these stories, because they were kind of, a hot topic. And I think that I can't speak in general about Balkans because I don't have a good idea of what is happening in Albania or in Bulgaria or whatever. But I think that my impression is that the Balkan countries have, in general, an issue of dealing with these topics because, in a way, the history of the region is still a history of wars and conflicts till the end of the 20th century, and still, the let's say emotions are still strong. We need to find a way to better deal with all these things, and realize that especially when it comes to Balkan countries and Balkan nations, we more or less share a common history, apart from a very similar culture and civilization, and that we need to have a bit more of a confidence to speak about these things openly. Because the nationalisms of the 20th century did not do us much good in the way we view each other and the way we view our history and our culture.
And it's kind of scary when you see how nationalism is rising once again, this time in Western Europe, in the United States, and it might eventually return back to the Balkans. Personally, it terrifies me, but I don't know about you.
Well, it's let's hope that it won't happen and that we have left all these things behind. But as you say, tensions rise all over the world, and Balkans have proved to be, one of the most volatile regions in Europe. So I'm trying to be optimistic, but I'm also, afraid that this kind of new wave of nationalism will affect us as well. I just, my optimism is based on the fact that, at least in the recent decades, Balkan countries have managed to open, channels of communication between them, and we, have a kind of a different worldview than the people before us, and also in a way the competition between Balkan nations has more or less stopped. I mean, whatever issues there were have been resolved in the wars of the past. So I hope that there is no open issues.
There's a particular story from in the book that has stayed with me much longer, and it's Knocker, at least in English, and in Albanian the title was adapted or translated phonetically. I found it extremely powerful because it brings together so many things that run through the whole book, like, as you mentioned before, war, exile, feelings of guilt, and especially the idea that society depends on violence but prefers not to see it. And kind of the main character, but not the character who is telling the story, is someone who is celebrated initially as a hero when he returns to his village, but then rejected once he starts speaking honestly about what he has done during the war. And later finds a place in America where killing in a way becomes acceptable again, as long as it stays hidden. So I'd like to ask you, do you think societies prefer these heroic myths instead of honest wishes?
For sure. I'm 100% certain about that. Because, we just need to have a look around. I mean, what we need is a comforting story, even about, events that are absolutely terrible. We need to hear that, we did not participate in these events. We did not have our hand in committing all these atrocities or whatever. We were just, the guys that went there for something good. It's what we were hearing the past couple of decades about humanitarian wars that their aim is to restore democracy or whatever, this kind of things. So, in a way, we kind of wrap war in a more marketable shape, and we hid under the carpet, the real face of the war. So
Yes.
the fact that, apart from the violence, the intention is behind the war to control, certain region, a certain population, the resources of a certain region or whatever. We just, want to idealize our participation in that, and then again in everyday life, whenever for example, we ask for more security, more safety, which actually means that we need that we ask for more policing of the streets, more a bigger presence of security forces in our cities or whatever, what we're doing is we're asking actually for more people that have the power and the ability to exert violence to regulate things. And we tend to forget that, in these kind of conditions, things can go easily wrong. And we get surprised when we hear of an incident of unjustified police violence. We get to cry out that this is wrong. But actually, this happens because, in a way, we tend to ignore the evil that every human, in a way, the ability that every human has to commit evil and to commit violence. So this is, in a way, the point I'm trying to make in the whole book, and in this story in particular, that we have to be aware that we're not, a species born good, but rather we're a species that has both good and evil inside it. And in order for evil to not raise its head, we need to be conscious about it. We need to have rules. We need to regulate ourselves and be always aware and always ready to react when things start, taking this kind of route.
Something that struck me is that he's not punished for the things he did when he was fighting in the war, but for telling the truth about it, for finally coming out and describing and saying all the atrocities that he did as part of that war.
Yeah, because by telling the truth, you kind of break the illusion of modern civilization. Because I can't remember who has said that. There is a quote I remember, that modern civilization is not based on the extinction of abominable acts, but rather on hiding these abominable acts. So, in a way, it's a bigger crime if you speak about these practices rather than doing them in service of a society that benefits from them.
And there's that incredible passage in that story where he talks about being schooled in blood and about civilization as stepping on shit in high heels. It felt to me like one of the core philosophical moments of the entire collection. It's the moment when he says, if you meet a farmer covered in mud in the field versus in the church, like if you meet a farmer covered in mud in the field, you'll think he's a very hardworking person, but I'm paraphrasing here. But if you meet him covered in mud in the church, you would see him as backwards in a way, and someone who's dirty. I'm curious, were you exploring the idea that morality depends less on the act itself and more on where society chooses to place it?
Yeah, definitely that. It was, I was inspired partially for this short story on something that Mary Douglas had said, that dirt is matter out of place. And it was, a saying that kind of stuck me, that whatever we perceive as despicable, abominable, dirty, or whatever, has to do mostly with, the societal norms and the way, our culture deals with these concepts rather than the act itself.
And one final question. Were there any writers you felt close to while writing these stories, or you felt you were in dialogue with?
Well, when I was writing, I was having in mind almost exclusively the oral storytellers from my village. This is the world that I was borrowing from when I was writing the stories. Whenever I was coming across a certain question or difficulty about how I'm gonna express this thought or this, how I'm gonna describe this situation, I was always bringing in mind how my grandpa or a friend of my grandpa would have spoken about that. So Jak's references, let's say, is less literary and more, coming from this kind of oral tradition. On certain stories, there might have been, references to let's say, in brackets, more crazy things like the story of the 40 Ronins from medieval Japan. I mean, the first story, Dota Press Kotsidete, is about a character who, in my mind, was more or less like a samurai. So following really strictly code about revenge and, his eagerness to have his revenge as soon as possible.
Since you mentioned that story, it is kind of open-ended. Like, we never really find out if he actually took his revenge. I mean, he kills the guy he thinks killed his sister, but we never know, like, was he really the guy or not?
I'm really happy to hear about that and to learn that you read it that way, because that was my intention, to be honest, to have this kind of uncertainty on whether he found the killer or not, because he's so much into this state of mind of finding the killer of his sister and taking revenge that he gets blind by his emotions, and he's quick to see hints and clues where there might not be. And he also gets a confession of the guy after torturing him really cruelly. So it's I'm happy to hear that this worked, because it was my intention. And speaking of this character and the character Noker that we mentioned before, they're kind of the two opposite poles of the same spectrum. The first one, the one in Dota Press, is someone who, despite the fact that he experiences blood and violence in war, so let's say in the bigger picture,
yes,
he's still fixated with his familial blood, the spilled blood of his sister, and he's hell bent on revenge. While the character in Noker is the guy who has managed to have a general picture of what the blood of war is about. So they're kind of, the polar opposites. And this was the reason that I placed these short stories in these positions in the book. So there is kind of a progression from the personal blood to the ecumenical, the blood of humanity towards to at the end.
Thank you so much, Dimosthenis.
I thank you for this really interesting conversation and for giving me the chance to speak about the book that was published in Albanian. Actually, it was one of the things that I yearned the most in all these years that the book circulates in Greek, that it will get translated in Albanian, because I have many Albanian friends here who were quite intrigued with the title, and they were recognizing, customs and words in the in the text, and I was always curious about how it will be, received by Albanian readers, and I'm really happy that with this opportunity we'll have the chance to speak about the book again.
I really enjoyed.
I thank you for that.
It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed both the book, the stories, and the conversation with you. So the pleasure is all mine.
Me too.
Ky podcast mbështetet nga Abi Bank.